I'm working on matters to do with Ukraine actually since 2006. I have been to Ukraine a lot between 2006, 2012, 13. Then there was Syria and the refugee situation in Turkey. I moved to Turkey. I compared the two cases quite a bit, not actually from an angle of forced migration, but rather irregular migration, transit migration, border control, migration control, border security, a whole lot of issues. And often I have been to Georgia only once. I have been to Russia, but only once. I have seen Belarus. I was in Belarus for 5 minutes, stepping across the border when I was in Lithuania in some border guard station. They just asked, "Oh, do you want to go to Belarus?" "Oh, yes, sure." And then I stepped. I saw the fence from the other side. It was where the Kaliningrad train crossing was. It was anthropological because I stayed in the border guard station. I watched all the monitors and the CCTV cameras and whatnot. So I have some background, but very often I felt I'm the only one. I was one of the first in Ukraine. I was in Sumy on the Russian border. The border guards took me up and down the border to show me everything. I had to drink a lot of vodka and eat kasha and whatnot. I loved it, but I never reflected on the fact that I seem to have been the first and only one. And I didn't notice really this negligence of research and knowledge in the field. And last year, when we saw the events on the Polish and Lithuanian border with Belarus, I again saw the issue there. I saw the conflict, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and I felt, oh, we need to do something. We need to look into the case. And I thought there is a window of opportunity there. And then, of course, November, I was pretty certain there will be war. I was scared, tried whatever I could to alert the public. Nobody was interested. Nobody took it serious. And just the day before the war, I was in Lviv. We had a meeting with Ukrainian Catholic University, with Caritas. The next day, I was in Warsaw at the CMR to discuss the idea of a major regional forced migration refugee conference, which has all been turned upside down by the war. Now it sounds cynical to talk about a window of opportunity because it's very, very urgent that we enhance and strengthen research in that part of the world. And with the ideas I'm going to share with you, so I talk about forced migration refugee studies in the East. Is there a need for acknowledging the global East as yet another epistemic concept? I hope to get some ball rolling and to encourage and to facilitate and enhance academic interest, basically. And I first want to talk about the purpose and the aims of this workshop. So I will address matters in the countries, I like to say, east of the EU, but north of the Middle East, north of the Himalaya mountains, and west of China. There are other ideas and other definitions. And the region of question, the region in question, and you know this much better than I suppose, has gone through a profound socioeconomic political transformation. It displays enormous power disparities between various countries, enormous inequalities. Some countries are now amongst the poorest in the world. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, even Ukraine and Moldova, whilst on the other hand, Russia's GNI is up to 10 times higher than that of the countries that I've just mentioned. The region is also riddled by conflicts. Think about Armenia, Azerbaijan, the recent fighting over the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, events in Kazakhstan. We have many conflicts lingering for long times, not only frozen conflicts, but conflicts flaring up occasionally. Many countries are characterized by more or less authoritarian ruling. We have witnessed the displacement of millions of people, and often they are in a protracted situation. People are becoming more and more affected by climate change, which induced forced migration. But on the other hand, the countries are very often neglected by migration research, certainly by Western research. I don't want to talk so much about research in the region because there is obviously quite a bit. The region also shares borders or is in close proximity to other troubled countries, notably Afghanistan, Syria, Iran. It receives some refugees, at least from these countries. And yet the countries in the West and in the Southwest, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, they are all distinctly different. So I insist that we cannot look at it through the lens of commonality. There is a lot of differences also. And I would like to make 3 points. First, I consider academic attention paid to forced migration refugees in this region and demonstrate that the region is ignored by Western academia, by mainstream Western academia. Second, I believe there are specific reasons for this, and I argue that we need a new conceptual lens, exactly the Global East, to address shortcomings in the way how we think about the world. And third, I want to briefly discuss whether we should apply a specific post-colonial and possibly maybe also non-communist or anti-communist perspective here, and I will explain why that is. And now to my first point. Already last year in spring, I conducted a qualitative survey of reports and academic publications on forced migration, displaced persons and refugees in the region. It was not representative, but still it implies some very uneven coverage of the issues at stake. Generally, I felt knowledge production is rather imbalanced. For instance, there was a lot more on forced migration in the 1990s and early 2000s, and a lot less on the 2010s and 2020s. There was quite some research on Russia, including Chechnya, also Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, but little on Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, almost nothing. Just one case, I found nothing that was Ingushetia. There is more research on IDPs than on refugees, I felt. There is, in the focus on Ukraine, there is a focus on IDPs, including Tatars, but not refugees in Ukraine, which is a matter that I studied quite a bit. There is overall some small cluster on climate change and migration, conflicts in eastern Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, persecution of LGBTQ groups in Chechnya triggered some cycles of academic and non-academic publications. There is disproportionate attention, I felt, paid to irregular migration, to human smuggling, and human trafficking, and quite some of these imbalances I felt are driven by international organizations, so mostly by Western actors, IOM, ICMPD, UNODC, who pay for research and studies. Such imbalances are in part caused by the fact, I believe, that within the region, forced migration can be a sensitive and politicized issue. Not everything sensitive is possible to research. The room to maneuver for some researchers in some countries has become more limited, notably if people are labeled foreign agents, for instance. And then this year, I complemented my qualitative study with a quantitative survey of all written pieces published in the 4 key migration and refugee journals, in Refugee Studies Quarterly, in the Journal for Refugee Studies, in the Journal for Immigration and Refugee Studies, and in Forced Migration Review. And this demonstrates that actually only out of 2,385 pieces, only 9 were devoted to matters in the Global East, 0.5%. And of these 9 pieces, 5 covered Georgia, before covered Ukraine, and all other countries were not subject of any academic investigation. And given that in previous times there were over 3 million displaced persons and refugees in the region, that was in the 1990s, and there are still over 2 million people before the Ukrainian conflict, that was still 2.5%. Now that has risen at least to 11 million, so it's 12% of the total forcefully displaced population. We have a case here of vast underrepresentation, at least in these 4 journals, of forced migration refugees in the region. Of course, there are articles in other journals, and you have probably published quite some of them, notably in area studies, but still I believe it shows that in the key forced migration refugee journals, the Global East is almost absent. It's just not there. It's the same in international relations studies. I read there is a Danish IR scholar, Malksø, who complains about that. And Oskanyan also bemoans, and I quote, post-colonial scholarship has overwhelmingly focused on the legacy of Western empires, but Russia, in its various incarnations, has never received the same amount of critical scrutiny. Eastern migration researchers in particular, and maybe Eastern intellectuals in general, seem to be missing from the global Anglo-Saxon and French-dominated knowledge community. And now to my second point. I think there are 2 reasons for this negligence. The first is straightforward. There are probably practical reasons. There is a language barrier. Fewer scholars master Russian than English. The languages of the global north are widely spoken in the global south, but they are different from the languages spoken in the global east. And the fact that the global south and the global north can and do communicate with one another, whereas the north and south cannot communicate easily with the east, is in itself a result of different colonizations. And there is therefore a general lack of a tradition of research of northern and southern scholars of Eastern affairs. Finally, there are, I've hinted at that, probably also legal limits. At least colleagues in Russia and some other countries mentioned that to me. And B, but this is my main point now, for epistemological reasons, the region is widely overlooked. Notably, the very prominent concept of the global north and the global south, the binary, obviously renders the east invisible. There is no east in the global north and the global south. The countries in and conditions of the east are not recognized a region or topic in their own right. They are not even subsumed, I believe, under the global north, global south categories. Russia is not considered part of the global north. Uzbekistan or Tajikistan are probably not considered part of the global south idea. The countries in the region are rather excluded from both. So there is a case of double exclusion, according to Müller. The East is not thought of as part of global connections. It is, and I quote, outside of the circuits and conduits of Western knowledge architecture. And as I have shown, this is certainly the case in forced migration refugee studies, where the East is absent. Even worse, in much of the current debate on Ukraine, countries like Ukraine in particular have no agency or even denied agency. They are denied full sovereignty. They are asked to give in to Russia's claims. So in other words, according to this perspective, there is no global East, neither conceptually nor empirically, and nothing that requires a separate theory. However, there have, of course, been other forms of thinking about the East. It was once denoted the second world, situated between the first and the third worlds. We don't use that anymore. We dropped the concept for its hierarchical thinking and also for the diminutive undertone. The region is also described as Eurasia, which is a geographic concept on the one hand, but it's actually very elusive when I try to find out the delineation, what Eurasia means. It sometimes stretches from Portugal to Vladivostok, with or without India, with or without China, with or without Vietnam and other countries. But it's also meanwhile ideologically connoted and reflects some imperial Russian thinking, and therefore I find it fairly problematic. Another concept, of course, is the post-Soviet space, which sometimes equals the newly independent countries or the Commonwealth of independent countries. But here the denominator lies in the past, the post or the new. But it's a long time ago. And Kuleba, for instance, Ukrainian minister, argues that countries since have followed very different trajectories, that at least the young generation has no memories of this past anyway, because it's too long ago. Also, the frame Slavic studies, I think it doesn't capture well the region that I want to talk about, because it includes the Slavic countries in the Balkans, but it excludes non-Slavic countries in Central Asia. So why then would the concept of the global East be any better? What could it achieve that other concepts cannot? First of all, introducing the concept of the global East breaks up and expands this narrow binary of the global North and the global South, and brings back to global academia a whole set of countries that are often overlooked. And second, it acknowledges the important global connections the East has. They are there. We don't only think about oil and gas and grain and other exports. We also need to think about the internationally still powerful Russian narrative, notably in parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, the new Silk Road trade axis, or of course the migration of people within the region and across the region, the export of workers within and beyond the region. Third, it captures well, and that's Müller's argument again, liminality, notably the liminal position of countries that are not quite north, they are not quite south, but they are different, they represent, that's his argument, a category in itself. And third, the concept pays due respect to the experiences of the former Second World countries, and indeed the legacy of Russian imperialism, of Soviet authoritarian ruling and colonization. Fourth, it captures the emergence of a new version, maybe, of an ideological East-West divide, the liberal West on the one hand versus the conservative, illiberal East. It's how I read some of Putin's statements. Fifth, the East, I've said that, does not imply socio-political or economic communality, rather the opposite. It acknowledges significant diversity within the region, again, an argument that Müller stresses. So the key marker is being different, is being overlooked by the North and the South alike, and having a specific colonial history, different from power relations and inequalities between the global North and the global South. And then six, the East has something important to tell the North and the South. This is another of Müller's arguments, and I will say a little more about that in a minute. And this is Soviet experience and the experience of liminality. North and South have also something to learn about their own shortcomings and of the current version of post-colonialism. And most importantly, that's the last point, seventh, I agree with Müller that the concept global East puts the East back on the map of knowledge productions, and that's what I really like to promote. And now to my third point. So whereas the global North and the global South binary is essentially aiming at depicting the inequality, injustices, and colonial past, there is a danger to approach the global East in a depoliticized fashion. and through the lens of yet another form of area studies. But that's not what is meant here. So simply studying the Global East in order to understand it better, for the sake, for instance, of enforcing an imperial or capitalist project, could amount to yet another colonial practice similar to the Orientalism that Said criticized. The key to the concept, I believe, is to take the specific colonial history in the region as a starting point. And of course, let the people of the region speak. This requires analysis of the historical and contemporary colonialities: Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, Ottoman Empire, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Persia, maybe even Mongolia and the Huns, but specifically since the 16th century, mainly the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and then the self-declared state continuator of the Soviet Union, which is now the Russian Federation. But also from a German perspective, I would say it is imperative to consider the colonial perspective Nazi Germany had of the East, the Lebensraum im Osten, the living space in the East. It aimed to conquer them, it partly enslaved, and it partly terminated its people, exploited the natural resources, and populated with Aryan settlers. Also, there is, of course, some anti-Slavic racism held in the West. First, we find it by Marx and Engels, and we find it by the Nazis, then we have it in some public discourses, and it's certainly time to acknowledge that and understand better where we, or I, in the West, come from when we talk about that part of the world. And until this day, much of the Western discourse on the war still displays this colonial approach, in that often, and I've said that Ukraine, and the same is maybe also true for Moldova, for Georgia, and for the respective nations, are denied subjectivity. They are sacrificed almost to Russia's colonial ambitions. And in fact, perceiving Ukraine, for instance, an object is a practice that stretches back to the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, to contemporary Western denial of Ukraine's agency. And according to Snyder, this is an archetypical colonial situation, treating a country an object. For the moment, I want to only concentrate on the past 400 years, with the exception of the Third Reich, which is characterized by the conquests of the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation. And Anna Amelina, who is here with us today, refers to the importance of some of the legacies of Tsarist Russian Empire, which is still visible in Russian official authorities' references to pre-revolution imperial maps. There is the Soviet Union's role in defining Ukraine, defining borders in many parts of the world in Central Asia. And Ryabchuk, for instance, suggests that there are three versions of Russian colonialism: standard colonialism in Central Asia, internal colonialism in Ukraine, and light colonialism in Central and Eastern Europe. And I haven't checked or tested that. We can discuss all of that. We might also want to think, of course, of Polish colonialism and its heritage. But I would argue that nowadays Poland rather supports Ukrainian sovereignty and does not try, as in earlier times, to use the conflict, exploit the conflict to snatch or occupy parts of Ukraine. So I believe that this Polish heritage is a lot less urgent nowadays. And Melke, Danish IR scholar, argues that Ukraine is on a colonial leash. Snyder elaborates that the Russian claim of being a state civilization, while suggesting that Ukraine as a nation does not exist, is a typical argument brought forward by imperial powers, and concludes and I quote, that there is modern Russian imperialism and that the war on Ukraine is a colonial war. So then, Ukraine's defense and resistance, Malke again argues it's a freedom war. It's a decolonizing moment, not only for Ukraine, but probably also for other Central and Eastern European countries, and maybe even others, who are taking side and support Ukraine. Snyder, again, I quote Ukraine, the nation is a post-colonial creation of something new. It's a post-colonial product. We can discuss that. And in the context of post-colonial thinking, Russia is considered sometimes either the poorest country in the north, in economic dwarf, dependent on Western technology, and thus only secondary to the dominant powers, notably to the US. Morozov coined this term of the subaltern empire, which I find quite interesting to elaborate upon. And this suggests, of course, that imperialism and colonialism are not two simple poles of the powerful, the powerless, the rich and the poor, but something where we need to think along a scale, or Morozov suggests in relational terms. Just think of local repressive agents as some writers suggest, the colonized mimicking the colonizer, hybrid identities as Mbembe highlights, or colonial hierarchies where some countries suffer more, whereas others partly benefit. So Ukraine has always been a more sort of beneficial countries within the Soviet system, I suppose. Russia first aspired becoming a leading partner within the West, and specifically the European system. Russia aimed at diminishing or maybe even replacing the Euro-Transatlantic Alliance. This is how I read Putin's talk in the Berlin Parliament in 2001, which has been replicated by the foreign minister Ivanov at that time. But only when Russia failed, it began, I believe, re-establishing and reinforcing its own Eastern system or empire. Russia likes presenting itself and other countries as victims of US American, and thus as a subaltern vis-a-vis the US. And this explains maybe why Russia has sympathies in the global South. And whilst this is to distract from its own imperialism, I have shown that in academia, Russia is still not widely perceived a colonizer. And now to my last point, and I'm coming to the end. My last point is rather a question. I have been puzzled by some strong public admiration and support Russia enjoys in the global South, as much as I have been puzzled by the lack of interest or even ignorance in post-colonial thinking with regards to Russia as a colonizer and the countries which are objects of Russia's ambitions, and wonder why that is. In particular, I wonder whether there is an element in the post-colonial approach going back to the popularity of Marxism-Leninism in the then Third World and its liberation struggles, which prevents critical thinking of Russia. I have a question mark on all of it. And finally, I wonder whether the fact that the Ukrainian post-colonial project is intrinsically European, democratic, liberal, but also capitalist, which may then generate less sympathy than the more openly socialist, anti-colonial struggles that we have seen in the past. And indeed, in South America, a scholar, De Souza, has identified certain Marxist anti-colonialists who are still full of patronizing determinism, power thinking, centralism, etatism, and authoritarianism. And he therefore even calls for the decolonizing of some versions of post-colonial thinking. I have no expertise in these matters. I'm rather puzzled. I have questions, and I either leave it to you experts or to students of post-colonialism to find out more about this. Thanks for your time and being my guinea pigs today, sharing my preliminary ideas. I hope it wasn't all completely wrong. Thank you.